straight down button. Look where my finger is. Look where my finger is. That's a picture, then it starts. Yeah, you don't have to focus. It'll focus on that. It will. Unless we hit something. Sorry guys. Is it not focusing?
Not focusing, but I'll hit it again.
What's going on? Why don't you stand there for a second?
Yeah.
Sorry, y'all. We're going to make this work.
Either one of us on this
Stand
camera.
right there. You just have to do this. Now it's focused.
Okay.
I just did it manually. Alright, it's off now. So start again. Alright. Put up.
Hey folks, just want to welcome you to Revolve tonight. My name is Kobe Cole, I'm the program director here. Just a couple things before we get started, before I bring George, Terry, and Donald up for a special presentation tonight. If you need to go to the bathroom, they're out the door to the right and then right on the left. There's 2 bathrooms there, they're all bathrooms, and then there's a ton of, about 4 bathrooms on the far end of the hall. Feel free to use whatever bathroom you are comfortable in. If you have your phone, go ahead and put it on vibrate or turn it off so that it doesn't interrupt George's flow when it gets going. Just a couple things about what we do here. Number one, we're really happy to have UNCA and be able to have UNCA students in the building. We work pretty closely with the STEAM folks, and we're always looking to collaborate and work with the area universities. At the moment, we have the Western Carolina University MFA grad show that's up next door. So when there's a break or after we're finished, you're welcome to take a look at the show and see what's up with that. And then the show we have currently in the project space is called My Place or Yours. It's a show that was curated by Cara Hagan from Appalachian State University. And it's like kind of a really interesting concept and interesting underlying theme that takes a little time to kind of read and absorb. So again, if you have a chance afterwards, feel free to take a look around if you have any questions. I'll be here. You can ask me, I'll be happy to answer them for you. Otherwise, it'd be great if you take a look at our website, revolve.org, and see what we get up to. We do a lot of things here, talks, shows, we got live music, we do performance, we show films, we do all sorts of things. So we'd love to have students here more often. You know, the students are always welcome here for free, and we'll just be happy to facilitate things with you guys as much as possible. I'm really happy to have George here tonight. George is obviously a building mate. But beyond that, he's what I would consider what Asheville's really all about, what the kind of heart of Asheville's about. It's kind of an honor to have him here to present this work about his time in the 80s in New York City. The music we were listening to as we came in was also a CD that he put out. You may know he's also a musician, painter, and now a fledgling art historian. And so we're happy to be able to present his first presentation about this time in the 80s. In New York City. I'm happy to have George here and just want to welcome him and hope you guys will too. Thank you very much.
And thanks to Colby too, because he's the guy that makes this place run with some help, lots of help, and it's a real great community facility. And as he said, it's always free for students, and there's so many different kinds of things going on here. So please come back as you remain in the area and support this fun place where so much is going on all the time. It's not just chocolate. I'm going to start here, folks, by telling you that I moved to New York City in January '83 from Chapel Hill, where I graduated, with a bunch of friends. We all drove up the same day. Some got out in Washington, and the rest of us came on to Manhattan, and we arrived right after the explosion of the art scene. It was kind of the peak of it, really, in a way. It had been going on for years. It was also the middle of the Reagan years, Reagan presidency, which, if you were keeping up with the punk rock scene, it was the clampdown, and that was happening all over the Western Hemisphere and in Europe. A lot of change was going on in that generation that came of age after Vietnam had ended and the United States had gone through some seriously difficult economic times, and New York City was emblematic of how bad the economic times were. It was a dilapidated area. I'm not going to bother showing you too many scenes of that, but I am going to show you how the decade ended. This is basically about the decade of the 80s and the art scene that happened in that ruin and decay in New York City. I will say that a lot of folks flocked to New York City from colleges, partly to get away from the restrictive conservatism of the United States out in the hinterlands. And for example, the senator from North Carolina at the time, Jesse Helms, would say that they need to put a chain link fence around Chapel Hill and keep us all in because we were so weird. So we saw the writing on the wall, so we all moved to New York, a bunch of us anyway. So we were called the Chapel Hill Mafia, some of us, and still are, and we revel in that name. But that was happening in other college towns and other places all over the country. People were coming to New York. So I was part of a second, maybe even third influx, and not necessarily part of the first wave of hipsterism. What I'm going to show you right now is the end of the decade. So this is a little clip. We got it to
this park, which is a beautiful park, had been taken over by squatters and drug pushers and drug users and vagrants, and they kept it going 24 hours a day. It was an outrageous situation. The Parks Department closed the park at 1 o'clock in the morning. That ultimately ensued in what we're here to talk about, a riot. Cops were subject to violence from this, and people wanting to physically injure them, and they were. The cops injured, they responded by clubbing people. Sometimes clubbing the people who injured them, and sometimes innocent people. There were professionals there who caught much of the mayhem on camera, and it was horrible.
So I happened to be visiting Los Angeles that day because I went to grad school after New York, after years of teaching school in New York. So I missed the riots, but I was in a studio with some great musicians and a band called XTC. I got to be hanging out with them that day, and they turned the television on in the break room. We're 3 hours behind, so boom, there it was. Friends of mine getting their heads clubbed. The guy that took the video was a fellow I knew from down in the Lower East Side, and we're going to get into that here in a minute. So, we arrived in the middle of this explosion, and New York City, like I said, had been kind of dilapidated and falling apart and decaying. Therefore, it was affordable for artists to come in and find. This is the old story. Every town we have to go through this same scenario where the artists can live anywhere, and they fix up a place and make it more palatable for the middle class to move in, and then gentrification comes. So this is the story of that dynamic. It happens again and again since that period of time. It's also similar to what happened in Paris in the 1860s and 70s. There was a lot of freedom, the beginning of modernism, beginning of modernist painting, and then certainly Impressionism, and symbolist poetry, and historical fiction that had sociological commentary. Then the French got into a war with the Prussians, and they got whipped. And the Franco-Prussian War ended with poverty and destitutism, and folks in Paris reacting to what their government had done. And there was something called the Paris Commune. And let me make this full screen for you guys. And this is just one of the engravings. There are some photographs of the Paris Commune, but it's mostly people posing. But artists manned the barricades, as they say, and they barricaded certain parts of Paris off from first the Prussians, and then from the right-wing government that was trying to take back. Soldiers in the army, a lot of the factions of the army joined, and it was a bloodbath. I saw I see New York City in the 1970s and 80s as being kind of a reflection of a similar dynamic that happened in Paris, in France those years. This man was a poet who was one of the people that was manning the barricades. His name is Jean-Louis Arthur Rimbaud, and he's considered one of the most revolutionary poets of the 19th century, and influenced a lot of modernist thinking and modernist writing. And he only wrote poetry for about 2 years. One of the artists, the main artist that I'm focusing on in this presentation is an artist named David Wojnarowicz. And David was heavily influenced by Rimbaud as well, the romantic poet who was rebellious. By the way, the commune, they were the first communists too, by the way. They were demanding socialist practices began. And you may know the lady on the left. If you don't, her name is Patti Smith, and she was one of the more intriguing rock and rollers of the period, during the punk period in New York City, and she also very much was an acolyte, I guess you could say, of Rimbaud's. So was Bob Dylan, and she was an acolyte of Bob Dylan. Dylan actually wrote some songs about Rimbaud. So this kind of bohemian culture, if you guys are all kind of familiar with that, sprung up in Paris in the 1800s, was happening in this dilapidated New York City downtown scenario. And David Wojnarowicz was in France in the mid-70s, came back to New York and began to live a life partly on the street, partly not. And his first pieces were took a lot of pictures of his friend Brian Butterick with a Rimbaud mask from that very photograph that I just showed you, which is the cover of Les Illuminations, Rimbaud's Illuminations. And Wojnarowicz was first a poet. He worked in bookstores and read poetry a lot more at the beginning than he did any of this visual stuff. But he became like a street artist, and he was one of many. I'll show you a couple of these other ones. This is Rimbaud on the subway. I kind of relate to that one. And this is Rimbaud at the piers, and you'll notice the drawing in the background is of a junkie shooting up. That was part of the dangerousness of the culture, I could say. It was part of the color of the culture at the time, and many people didn't survive that particular investigation. This is, when I say the piers, artists were not able to find spaces to work in that they could pay rent and afford. And Soho, down below Houston Street, is a very fancy neighborhood, and it had become fancy by the mid to late 70s. The rest of Manhattan and the rest of lower downtown Manhattan was still dilapidated. Artists that were coming to town were forced to live in these dilapidated tenements and go and look at art in this fancy, wealthy place called Soho. On the other side of Soho were the Hudson River piers, which had serviced shipping and all kinds of mercantilism throughout the last 2 centuries. And these guys found a respite and a place they could make their art and not have to pay for it. And this is one of Wojnarowicz's pieces, and it's kind of one of his stock characters that he uses in some of his stencil art and downtown street art. And this is the sick cow with his tongue sticking out, pretty obvious. Let's see, where are we at here? This is a pterodactyl from the same Pier 37. That place is no longer there. One of the interesting things, Wojnarowicz found a bunch of drawings that were done by people who had been declared mentally insane by the Justice Department of New York City over the whole century. They had saved all these drawings at some point in the 30s and 40s. After Freudianism had come in, they did these experiments with crazy mental patients and who had been violent. And he and Kiki Smith, who you'll find out about later, found these drawings in these piers and used them. We don't have any extant versions of these drawings, but it's pretty interesting that it was a respite and a refuge for these folks. And people were making art on the street. We're going to get to that a little bit more here, and this is one of David Boynton's stencils. You would see these all over town, downtown, on the walls, and some of these stencils were used to advertise bands and shows. He was in a band called 3 Teens Kill 4. And then Wild Style happened, and these things were all happening concurrently. I can't possibly do this lecture chronologically, and I'm covering about 1/9 of what went on. I'm not even skimming the surface of all the stuff that went on, and I'm hoping that this can grow into a larger investigation. Wild Style was a video that was made, or a movie that was made, about the graffiti artists that were skateboarding all over Manhattan and going into the train yards at night in the Bronx and spray painting the trains so that their art could be seen all day long everywhere in Manhattan, because those trains went everywhere. So these are some of those. Wild Style was a movie made, shot by a guy named Charlie Ahern, and he and his brother are still alive, John Ahern, and they were very much involved in every facet of the development of the East Village and downtown scene. This is one by Futura 2000, who was immortalized by The Clash in one of their songs. In fact, they had Allen Ginsberg, poets, say his name and talk about him in some of their songs in Combat Rock. I did a close-up of how he did a kind of a trompe l'oeil of cracked windows and stuff on the trains, which are all pretty much cracked anyway. And this is Lee Quinones. Graffiti is art. If graffiti is an art, and if art is a crime, let God forgive all. And this would ride through the city. And this is Zephyr, another. This is just a few of these guys. I don't want to waste too much time on this. There's a whole lot of scholarship on the graffiti scene, and many of the folks that survived this period are wealthy and pretty much showing in Europe all the time in galleries doing their graffiti. And that was part of the scene that happened in New York City in the 80s. And when I arrived there. This is a gallery in the Bronx called Fashion Moda, and it was opened up by some of the members of an organization called Collab, which started a gallery downtown called ABC No Rio. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And there was an attempt to bring the Bronx and the Lower East Side together, and that may have happened if it hadn't been for the gentrification of the Lower East Side. The Bronx was not ready for gentrification in the 80s. In fact, it's only starting to happen in the last 10 years or so. The Bronx was really like a war zone in those days. So this was bringing the art and the graffiti to those folks. I taught up in that area, so it was a really cool thing that they did that. Richard Hambleton was a British artist who moved to New York in the late 70s, and he would do these paintings on the walls, and they were designed to frighten would-be gentrifiers. And anybody that particularly was from the suburbs that already had a built-in fear of a certain visual experience of a black man on a wall would freak out when they came around. And so would black men. Anybody that saw somebody jumping up at them out of the wall at night, it was very effective. It's called Shadow Man, and he made a career off the Shadow Man. And then we have Samo. And Samo was a poet. He originally started as a poet, and he was two guys. It was Al Diaz and a fellow named Jean-Michel Basquiat, you may have heard of. And if you study Warhol soon, you will study him more intensely. Most of his pithy poems were spray painted in and around Soho or on the way from the East Village to Soho, so that people who were trying to spend their money wisely and invest in art so they could take it back to Berlin and sell it for more, or to Vienna or Geneva or London, were his targets. Very heady, and he hung out in the School of Visual Arts scene with Kenny Scharf and Keith Haring and other early street artists who painted on the walls and the subways, and kind of took the art from the street eventually to the galleries. So we're going to look at a couple more of his. That says Samo, a pin drops like a pungent odor. If you see the movie Basquiat, there's kind of a joke about he had a lot of the time before he got famous, he slept in Tompkins Square Park in a box, or he just didn't have the facilities to bathe. And he always used to talk about he smelled great anyway. And there's a funny scene in the movie about that, whether he does smell good or not. But I think pungent odor is supposed to mean more of some kind of effect on this pristine scene in Soho. And this one is from a movie that was made in 1980-81 called Downtown New York City. And it was, these guys were starting to get famous. And you can see this is the whole livery line, bow like this with the big money all crushed into these feet. And it's a play on words, and the neighborhood in the East Village is called the Bowery. So, but he used livery and Bowery. And I'll leave that for you to discover what that meant as a poetic experience. I can explain what I think, but it would ruin the process. This is Keith Haring, and you can see behind him is one of the quick drawings he would do on the subway. Back then, you didn't have jet printers. New York City didn't use jet printers. So they would have regular old posters glued up, and they would pull them down. There would always be a black background. So he got the great idea of taking chalk and doing these little drawings there. And it made him famous. He got thrown in jail 2 or 3 times. And this is him in the subway train leaving, kind of reminiscent. He would have seen William Robitz's Rambo on the subway by then, so that you could see the connection there. There's starting to be a buzz in the scene. People are starting to see what's going on. Galleries didn't start opening until 83-ish, late 82, in the East Village. And you kind of have to know the geography of the area, but there's East Village and then the Lower East Side. And the Lower East Side, much like the Bronx, was late to be renovated. Okay, and in some areas it's not quite renovated yet. Now this is a poster for The Radiant Child, which is Keith Haring's drawing. And the reason this is not available online with the word radiant in it, I believe, is because Radiant Child was a piece written by a poet named Rene Ricard, who you will run into with Warhol, who was part of the factory scene, and he also was an art critic. And he discovered, quote unquote, Basquiat, and wrote this great, long, praising article about him. Basquiat was drawing, painting on refrigerators, on window sashes that had been thrown in the trash, on wooden doors that were gates, whatever he could. It was street art, and people were buying it for nothing, and or they were letting him live in their houses, so he didn't have to pay rent. So he was in the scene, literally. Okay, and Keith Haring then certainly read that article. His baby probably existed anyway. What happened first is kind of hard to tell. We didn't have the internet at the time, so we can't date exactly who came up with that idea. But I do believe that the reason I can't say Radiant Child up there is it would be a breach of seniority or whatever, you know. So, this is later on when they were both big, rich, famous stars. Just to let you know where it's going. And this is when Keith Haring had Radiant Child up at the, that's the pin, that's the Times Square, the ball that drops, that's that. So, and I think now, yeah. Did I just kind of completely went past, oh yeah. I'm gonna let you watch a little video clip here, okay folks, hold on a second. This will be the last one. This explains a little more detail about the scene and Basquiat. Hope you can hear this.
New York City from the mid-70s up to the early 80s was a creative paradise.
New York was falling apart, going bankrupt. The straight people were all leaving, so all the crazy artists flocked here.
By the straight, he means necktie suits, not straight hadn't turned into the vernacular that means what it means now as much. We didn't have the same awareness of identity politics yet. That's CBGB's a good place to stop. Shouldn't be full screen, sorry guys. And I lived right down the street from CBGB's, and that was the punk club. And on Sundays, kids of all ages could come there, and with mohawks and everything else, and bling bling through their cheeks and their noses, and that kind of thing. And that's where that scene really blew up with Free Sundays. And some of the bands that played on Free Sundays are still out there right now. Anthrax is one of them. So that's the punk scene.
The time was electric. Anything felt possible.
Being very inexpensive rents, I was able to live for 80 hours a month. Like almost everyone who was living downtown in the late 1970s, we were intrigued by the remarkable conceptual graffiti of cinema. Even in my own building, there was a cinema graffiti right by the door.
I thought, this must be a street philosopher, somebody who's writing multiple choice questions on the wall, asking profound questions about values.
Samo was everywhere.
So Samo was everywhere, and that he had started to really become visible everywhere, not just on the street, when we moved there. And he was in shows that were happening one after another. Galleries were popping up, and they were fighting to get the few, maybe 10 or 20 great artists that were in the area that were getting hot. And part of it was because they knew they were selling already in Europe. People were coming over here, Germans particularly, were buying this kind of art and taking it back to Germany. And there was a simpatico between what had been going on in Germany in the art world, particularly with the generation that was born right after World War II, or maybe were children during World War II, and experienced the rebuilding of Germany and the rebuilding of a German identity after having been Nazis and having done all the bad things they've done. And that engendered an art scene called German Neo-Expressionism, which is another lecture altogether, but it influenced what went on here. So, downtown, while all this was bustling and bristling and these galleries were popping up, downtown, further down, was the Lower East Side. And we had, well, first we're going to go through some Keith Haring's work. This is his signature style. He came up with a simple style. He wanted to be able to appeal to anybody and everybody. But his style did begin in a very an unpalatable format, let's say. He was investigating his sexuality as a student at School of Visual Arts, and his work was pretty much outside of the mainstream. And that was, interesting to people as he began, but he found that getting thrown in jail from drawing on the subway, he found ways that he could make these images consumable by a wider audience. And I'm sure you've seen these things because it still exists today. He had a store after he got famous called the Pop Shop down in, guess where? Soho, after he'd gotten famous. And his goal was to make his work as visible as possible all over the world and to bring joy to people. And he did that, and he actually painted murals all over the world. He painted on the Berlin Wall before it came down. He was paid, there were commissions and stuff, but he always left free work in every city that he worked in. So I'm not trying to belittle his reputation, but I am going to compare him to other artists. This was at the end of his life, one of the later paintings, the last few years of his life. He succumbed to AIDS in 1990. So, we're going fast. This is the Fun Gallery, which was a gallery that was owned by Patty Astor, who's the star of that movie, Wild Style. She plays the reporter who's trying to find out what's going on with all these graffiti artists. So they got to even play with that dynamic of the suburban, wealthy, empowered person trying to understand what's going on with these other folks who are spray painting tonight. And those dynamics became instrumental to the tension between what I consider mercantilism and the integrity of an artist staying with his original inspiration. And that's kind of where my value system with this reinvestigation and this analysis of those days lays. That's where I'm going with this study. I was there at that show at Keith. I met him at that show, shook his hand, and he told me his sister was going to Carolina, where I just graduated. That's about all we talked about, though. Now, the real estate show happened at a place that later became ABC No Rio. Downtown further, in the dilapidated world, there was a building that had been left by the city, and artists wanted to use it. So they got some bolt cutters and opened it up and made a gallery out of it, and had this great show having to do with the problems of gentrification and dishonest landlords, and you can see by the octopus controlling buildings. There's not that much extant from this show, but it started what became ABC No Rio. After back and forth with the city and the housing police, they were able to get another space on Rivington Street, and it's still there. It's being renovated right now. It's survived. It's been funded. It's not something that they kept up, but it represents the beginning of squatting. And squatting was something that happened all through the Lower East Side in Manhattan. It's kind of celebrated now, but it no longer exists because there's too much money made in real estate. We're also hoping to see the parallels between then and now, as I begin to point out to you what Colby and I call the culture wars that I think we all can agree exist. This happened at ABC No Rio. This is a movie called Cave Women, made by these three women. Becky Howland, Kiki Smith is in the middle, and a friend of mine named Marnie Greenholtz is on the right. Women were also beginning to take their own power in the arts during this period, and that's very important as we move forward. This is a drawing by Judy Rifka, who's obviously influenced by the graffiti style. It's during a performance at ABC No Rio. She's a well-known artist. She's been in a few Whitney biennials, as is Kiki Smith. Now, that man right there is Joseph Beuys, who was the German art professor, the purveyor of the avant-garde, and taught many of the neo-expressionists that I was just telling you about in Germany in the 60s and 70s. Once again, that's another topic, but here he is at ABC No Rio during that real estate show. You can see in the background it says real estate show. He had his finger on the pulse all over the world. I wish I could tell you his story, but that's another story. This is Kiki Smith with her sister, Becky Howland, the artist Walter Robinson, a few other people, and they are called the ABC No Rio Cardboard Band. And they got gigs and got paid. This is a band called Live Skull. The lady in the middle is Marnie Greenholtz, who I showed you before. She was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine. We reconnected. Live Skull toured with, you may have heard of Sonic Youth and the Swans, that kind of scene, which is still happening. This is Kimbra Fowler. She has made a career as the voluptuous horror of Karen Black. And Karen Black was an actress who played some intense roles. The Great Gatsby was her most famous role as far as the general culture is concerned. And she always played a feisty woman, and she was in some 5 easy pieces with Jack Nicholson. So Kimbra assumed her persona and has this kind of goth rock band that's been going on forever. She and I were in some shows together later in the Lower East Side, so that's why I said that. This is a piece that she was in where they covered their heads up with cardboard boxes and people stuck them with hat pins at ABC No Rio. This is another place. This was the Times Square show called New York New Wave, and this happened in 1980, right after that real estate show. This is Tom Otterness, who was painting and getting shown before this period and after. The right side of it, that poster, is Charlie Ahern, the guy I told you about who made that movie. It's a photograph of his. And this was a show in which all of the soon-to-become art stars just about all of them were included in this show. They took a Times Square massage parlor that had gone out of business, and they had an art show there. And the people that did it are called Creative Time, and they were connected to CoLab, where the folks that started ABC in Rio. This is not well known because these aren't the people that made it in the big money world of the Lower East Side East Village art scene. These are people that have kept themselves going. The artists got famous, some of them, and moved on to Whitney Biennials, fame and fortune. But this is a very community-driven thing. This is John Ahern, Charlie's brother, and these sculptures were done in South Bronx and East Harlem, and he continues to this day. Most of his work is about the neighbors that he lives with. Once again, John Ahern. And this is Civilian Warfare, which is a gallery that was sprung up as the gallery scene popped out of thin air, sort of. And these guys, Dean Savard and Alan Barrows, Dean Savard's on the right, were the first successful gallery owners. However, they didn't take very good care of the business and didn't last that long. But David Wojnarowicz ended up being in their gallery. And so this gallery scene explodes up above Houston Street just at the same time people are starting to come in like me. This place opened like 2 months before I moved there. And some of the other galleries opened right after. Gracie Mansion was a gallery that a British lady started, naming it after the house that the mayor lives in, which is uptown. But it was originally in her bathroom in her apartment. And she had these shows called the Lou shows. The art would decorate her loo. And then she got a storefront that had been a church, I think, in her building, and that was her partner. His name is Sir Rodney Sir, and you can see why. And they really put together the first batch of group shows in East Village that made art stars out of some people, including Wojnarowicz. This is James Ronberger and Marguerite Van Cook, and I became friends with them because I had met David Wojnarowicz and he suggested I go befriend them. And they had a gallery called Ground Zero that was never run as a gallery. It was always a community space. A lot of fun stuff happened here, a lot of wild stuff. And they're very involved in the scene in New York still. And they helped David Wojnarowicz. And they built the community with many other people at their place. And David Wojnarowicz was involved with them too. This is one of James's paintings. This is of the Tompkins Square riots. It's called Tent City. So this happened in '88. The painting was done in '90, I think. Just thought I'd show you that. All right, now we're at David Wojnarowicz, and we're getting to the meat and potatoes. This is one of his first pieces called An Explosion, called History Keeps Me Awake at Night, that was in a show at Gracie Mansion called An Exploration of the History of Collisions in Reverse. And he had been making street art, doing some, what you would call subversive art happenings all over the Lower East Side and in galleries, which I'll get into in a second. And this is when he began to actually become a great painter, in my opinion. As I say, he was a subversive artist. Two of the things he did. PS1 is another space that is in Long Island City, and there was a show at PS1 in 1980 that also exploded the scene. All the folks that had, the East Village was exploding, and so PS1, which is just over the Queensboro Bridge, opened up as a space, kind of like ABC in Rio, but it had more funding. And they had great shows there too of the same artists. And Wojnarowicz was not included in that show. So he had developed this moving art form called cockabunnies. And he was interested in science. Cockabunnies are, you slightly anesthetize a box of roaches and put little bunny ears on their antenna. And then you release them at PS1 and in the offices of the people that run PS1. And that was his performance piece at that show. Another thing that he did, one of the more famous galleries down in Soho is run by a guy named Leo Castelli, a very famous gallery. He handled, maybe Warhol definitely handled Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns. He and some friends went and got some cow bones and wrapped them up in plastic and dumped them on the steps of Nick Castelli's gallery. Subversive. This one is a reenactment of a piece he did once he started getting famous for the Mnuchin family. So this is the father and mother of the budget director of Trump's White House right now. They were wheeling and dealing in the art world. They were part of the scene, making money, buying and selling art. They were buying and selling stocks and everything else too. So they gave him a commission, and he created this. These are 2 slides from that. He also dumped garbage, trash, and feces on their basement floor. It was meant to be a playroom for their children, including, I suppose, our budget director now. You can imagine how subversive that was. This is Kiki Smith in a movie before that period. She's the daughter of David Smith, who's one of the great sculptors. He's a British guy. She was actually born in Nuremberg, Germany, because he was there teaching, I believe. But she becomes very important to David's life. This is one of her early pieces. These are little glass spermies. It's hard to see. And she was showing at ABC New Radio as part of the Collab Collective. And these are bone people. And this is a glass stomach from '88. This piece, to me, connects the earlier period of conceptual art plus pop with what's going on in the '80s in New York, and it also transcends that time. And she was always a very busy artist. We'll see her hands later in the presentation. And I bring her in here because she, to me, represents the future. She's even more of a flow through because she's still alive. This is Basquiat as he became famous. This is called Hollywood Africans. And you can see he used the English language. He also used Spanish sometimes and French. And it's a simultaneity that happens with looking at these pieces. When you're looking at them, you kind of respond to him as a poet and as a visual artist at the same time. And this comes right out of the graffiti. This is he and Madonna, and his boyfriend with Madonna. I thought I'd throw that in. This is one of his great pieces called Skull, and I apologize that this slide's no tighter than it is. I encourage you to look at him more carefully than you might normally when you look through the history books. He is sometimes dispatched with by art historians and critics. His great work is great, in my opinion. And the reasons have to do with its resonance with the culture and the times, and semiotic awareness, signs of our times, the signifiers of our times. Boy and Rose is like that too. This painting was sold in auction at Christie's for, I think this is the one that was $48 million a few years ago. Recently, one of this painting went for $125 million. And this one's called Leeches. If you ever see the movie Basquiat, there's a section where he's being interviewed by, it's a composite of many different critics, and it's Christopher Walken is playing his critic, and he's asking these questions. And the real interview exists. In most of the interviews, Basquiat just saying nothing, kind of rolling his eyes. But at one point, Christopher Walken asked him, "So why do you draw such crude drawings? Why are you drawing so crude?" He goes, "Oh, I think most people are crude." And he says, "Why do you have leeches in here?" He says, "Well, it's just 46 and 42 leeches in the world." And he's playing a game with his public to be, you guys, and with certainly the market that he is entering in. He's exploding at this point in time, primarily because of European collectors. This one's called Profit, and you can maybe make the double entendre between the two different spellings of that word. Spine. Folks think he couldn't draw. He drew a certain way for a certain reason. And this is called Horn Players. And he was very much influenced by listening to bebop jazz as well as hip hop. He's in the video that Fat Bob Freddy did. He's in Blondie's Rapture video, if you ever see that. He's actually there because Fat Bob Freddy didn't show up that day. He was another rapper from those days. He's still around and he comments often on. You can see very many videos with him talking about Basquiat. But Freddie didn't show up. Basquiat got to be the turntable guy, which he didn't know how to do. Anyway, he also had an affinity for another. One of the things that Charlie Parker. This must be Charlie Parker, the saxophone player. Dizzy Gillespie from Sherall, North Carolina, by the way, South Carolina, on the right side. They and Miles Davis were the kings of bebop. Anyway, Charlie Parker died of a heroin overdose in 1954, and Basquiat would die of a heroin overdose in 87. This is when he got really famous. The New York Times Magazine in 85, and he made a point of not putting shoes on, and the art world was shocked. We're not shocked by that stuff so much anymore, thankfully. And then Warhol, people say Warhol preyed on him and his fame, and there's got to be some truth to that too. But they both appreciate each other. And all the artists that were working in the representational, cartoony, graffiti style owed some of their allegiance to Warhol. And you know, once again, we can't go into Warhol in depth here, but using pop imagery for your subject matter was revolutionary because art had always been about the church, or about ideals, or about philosophy. And Basquiat and Warhol had some kind of a rhythmic relationship, and their art, though, it's very funny. There's a video of, and this exists in the movie Basquiat, with David Bowie plays Warhol in the movie, where he says, "Jean, you just paint out everything I do," and then Basquiat goes, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" And so you'll see. So this is one of Warhol's stencils of meat, and he draws the crocodile over it, which I wonder if that's an Izod shirt he's talking about, or what other meaning does the crocodile have? Is it green, gold, and red? African, North African, reggae crocodile? So Basquiat's thinking, but he's trying not to be too obvious. And this is at the end of his life, when he knew he was going to die. It's called Death Rider. Once again, I think it's a great drawing. This is Jörg Immendorf, Café Deutschland. And this was a German expressionist, it's a classic German neo-expressionist painting. And this was what was getting sold in New York and becoming the back and forth between Europe and New York at the time, with the street artists, the graffiti artists, the hip-hop artists, and neo-expressionism really fueled the scene. And Joseph Beuys had made these guys kind of famous through, or at least made them acceptable in the art history, in the intelligentsia. And you can't see this, but this is my favorite painting by an artist named Sue Coe, who is still with us, who, by the way, the reason you can't see this is her work is hard to find, and I think it's been, I believe there's been a concerted effort to suppress her stuff. But this is Ronald Reagan in the bathtub playing with his nuclear weapons with some ghouls around him. And I found it in this video, so I took a screenshot of it. I know you can't see it very well. And this is Reagan, Admiral Poindexter, and Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State McFarlane. And these guys helped organize the Iran-Contra affair, where we sold, well, look it up. And Oliver North became famous because of this. Sue Coe is a British artist, but she was heavily influenced by this German neo-expressionist movement and the original German expressionist movement and other movements. And you can see it in her work if you look more carefully. She covered a lot of distance. I'm just going to go through a couple of these. I met her at the Marxist Society in New York. Yes, I went to a Marxist Society meeting, and we talked for a little while. And I was influenced by her work. This one's called Meat Grinder. And you can see, I think this one was on canvas. It's very Bosch-like. If you've looked at Hieronymus Bosch obviously trippy and hallucinatory. These people influenced me in my work, so that's why they're the ones that I'm drawn to make my point. Now this one you can't see, once again, it was on paper, you can see it's folded, and I believe this has been suppressed, or someone bought it and they don't want it reproduced, but a contemporary graffiti artist named Michael Stewart was murdered by the transit cops right about the time I moved to New York, like a month before I got there. And it was a big deal in the papers. This is sort of a picture of him. But then also the subway vigilante, while I was there, they kind of Bernard Getz, you know, there was a lot of crime on the subways, as Mayor Koch was saying. He shot 3 guys, emptied 2 chambers of 3 guys that were trying to run on the subway. And there was a big trial in the mid-'80s. And he was called the subway vigilante. And there was a lot of argument as to how far did he go over the line. And then Eleanor Bumpers was an insane lady who did not get social services. And she was stuck in her apartment in Brooklyn, wouldn't come out, and the housing cops went in and they murdered her. So these 3 things are all fused together in this painting. Very topical. This is Eleanor Bumpers. Bumpers cop back on the job. I remember that newspaper, the New York Post. Very conservative paper. Trump was in the New York Post just about every week with ads or something that he was doing for New York. And that's the close-up of Michael Stewart. Madonna and Basquiat were friends with him at the time he was murdered. And that's supposed to be the vigilante. Now this one is Suko's picture based on a rape scene. It's called, so a woman walked into a bar, as if you're telling a typical misogynist joke about that. And the misogynist joke is that in New England, 5 women raped this woman who went into one of the working class bars. So Suko did this painting about that. So we'll move on. David Hammonds was a guy I spent the most time with, and he's an African-American artist who came from LA to New York in the late 70s, early 80s. I think he had been connected a little bit to the Black Panthers as a young man. He grew up in Chicago. His work, often site-specific. He is a huge artist these days, famous. I can't find him. But this place was called Art on the Beach, once again started by Creative Time and Collab. And it was down next to the World Trade Centers. And it was the footing, it was a beach made out of gray sand, all cement. And it was the footing that had been dug in the 60s to build the World Trade Centers. You have to dig a whole bunch of dirt. So it's the sand from 3 centuries of New York City building downtown. And site-specific art was all across in this big lot. It later became a parking lot, and it was a several-tiered parking lot that was destroyed when the World Trade Centers came down. But I went down there to get away from it all, and I wrote one of probably my best songs there, and met David, and he built this octagonal hut. It's out of Thunderbird wine bottles, found pieces of wood. New York Times is the wallpaper inside. You can't see all that. And I hung out with him one day there, and we talked. I guess it was about April or May. And he had a big party there with, once again, sorry to get no better pictures, but this is the artist Sun Ra, passed away a few years ago, a jazz, fusion, funk artist, not unlike George Clinton, but actually a little more out there than George Clinton, I would say. And he had a show at the Art on the Beach opening. This is early '83. And obviously, this is, by the way, a New York police line barricade. And we put that up there to keep the police out, I guess. And he and I hung out a lot because he was working in the Schoenberg Center, which is a community center in East Harlem, and I was teaching school in Harlem. And he questioned my methods and my perspectives as to the content of my work and what I was focusing on. And over and over again, we talked at night about where I was working and why I was interested in applying to folks in Harlem and why I was interested in uptown versus downtown. And, you know, he made me clarify what I was doing, I think. I have a painting in which I celebrated this. A called Higher Goals. This was a commission at the Brooklyn Courthouse, and there was a bar called the Horseshoe Bar right beside Tompkins Square in Ajax, and we would collect beer bottle caps. And you see he would festoon these creosote telephone poles with these in African patterns. And you can look online, there's a description of what this means, but it's pretty obvious. The only goals that black men had been given in those days was to go be an athlete. And they didn't have any awareness of possibility of anything else, and that's what he's pointing to. And only David Hammonds could have made this piece of art. Here he is making it on the Brooklyn Courthouse in the grass. I didn't take these pictures, but I went visiting one day there. And that's just a close-up of the bottle caps. He would paint them sometimes. Martin Wong, who I also spent a day with him. I'd spent a day with David Warner Roberts. We're going to get to that in a minute. And Martin Wong had a show, at the same time I had a show in '88. So he saw my show and invited me over to his studio and we hung out. And we really did have similarities in our work. These are paintings of brick. Stanton Street near Forsyth Street, a dilapidated area. Those are gang human hand signals from sign language, which also was being used by gangs in a different way. What Martin Wong and I had in common is that he is the Asian American from San Francisco. I'm a Southern guy. We came to these neighborhoods, and rather than remaining other, separate, and observing from afar, we felt like we were part of the neighborhoods. And that's one of the things that we wanted to be able to do without being accused of being voyeuristic. And that's an argument we can continue to have forever. This is another one of his pieces. And Martin Wong and David Warner Roberts are represented by PPOW Gallery, which still exists. It's on 21st Street in New York. It was in the East Village. And they retain the estates of these artists, and they are publicizing them. And I would love to be able to share with you guys the piece I've just finished. We're seeking publication for it about Warner Roberts. I'm going to write about Martin. I'm going to write about David. I'm going to write about Kiki Smith. And there's a Basquiat one. It's already been written, but it needs to be edited. So I'd love to be able to share these with you for the future. So at some point, if let me share these links with you, I'll be glad to do that. Martin and I hung out one day and we talked about art. We talked about detail art and attention to detail. And I saw this painting in his house, his apartment, his studio. Let's see, this one is called Rampage, I think. Ravage. You can stare at these things for hours. And that's a self-portrait he did later in life. He went back to San Francisco when he found out he was sick. And he did die of AIDS in '99. And he used more of a Asian decorative style when he went back to San Francisco. And painted architecture that was Asian American owned architecture, stores and restaurants and such. This was done in 1980, but you can see that style already, continuing. Or starting, it started way back when he was a kid. And I've got books I can pass out here as we do Q&A in a minute, guys. Now this is Warner Roberts. He went from the stencil art to deciding that he was going to really try to paint what he felt. And his spiritual development, I believe, is part of this, and the spiritual development was motivated, I think, by the fact that there was so much death going on and destruction in his community, our community. Many folks were dying of AIDS. Gentrification was taking hold. It was difficult. It was becoming more and more difficult to live without money. Quote, assholes were moving into town. And also people were dying of heroin addiction. This is a painting that would take 3 or 4 hours to investigate, but it's called Crash the birth of language. And yes, in the middle there, that is exactly a copy of, or a rendering of the Clash Give 'Em Enough Rope album cover. So he was not afraid of, acknowledging his influences. I've written in my piece about him a detailed description in the next few paintings. This painting is owned by Adam Clayton of U2, the bass player. This one's called Some Things from Sleep for Jane and Charlie. And Jane and Charlie are Jane Dixon and Charlie Ahern, who I told you about. So the connectedness to the community, they were having a child when he made this painting. We're just going to be able to glance at these because to dissect them and not analyze them right now, we can go back at Q&A to any of these if you'd like to. The painterly style is becoming more evident. He's not just using stencils. And this one's called Late Afternoon in the Forest. You can see the Parthenon, repeated Parthenon up here. The battling centaur men. This is supposed to be a plane crash with maybe Woody Woodpecker's face. And right before this painting was done, the CIA had been funneling arms to Guatemala and through Guatemala to not the Sandinistas, to the Contras in El Salvador. And there was a big plane crash, and it became obvious that the CIA, that's when they were discovered. So I believe this has something to do with that. He kept up with the news. He watched television a lot. This is one of 4 pieces I'm going to show you. This is his most mature period, and these are great paintings to me. And this is called Wind, and it's Wind for Peter Hujar, who was a great friend of his, who was a photographer. And these 4 are called the Elements paintings: wind, earth, fire, and water. He uses the schematic, the connecting. There is some stenciling going on, but he painted over the stencils, and then this wing is an incredible piece of painting. These 4 were shown. He had a retrospective at Museum of Modern Art, at the Whitney in September of last year. This was called Earth. See the crashed train here and the infested jungle. And this one's called Fire. Buenarovic he made several trips, either to both to South America and one big trip to Mexico. In fact, he made that trip right after a few months after the day that I spent time with him, and it was right before he finished. He was in the middle of finishing these paintings. He came back and knocked them out and had a big show. And this one's called Water, and it's the most personal. So I think you'll agree that the painting facility has improved. This one was done, he did all kinds of work. He was in a band, he did performance art, he was in some movies. There was an organization called the Theater of Transgression, Cinema of Transgression, and one of the guys in that, the main filmmaker's name was Richard Kern. He went to Chapel Hill. We knew him. And he was in a movie that he did called Kill Me First. And it was originally, it appeared as a smut movie. I mean, not smut movie, it's a snuff movie, but it was really more a diatribe against suburbia as we knew it. Later in life, and this is where we're getting to where Buenarovic became more of a crusader than just an artist. He was involved in the movement to get funding for AIDS research. Many of his friends had passed away, and he found out that he had AIDS. And silence equals death. If you've seen those buttons, kind of originated out of some of his work. This is one of his pieces that was involved in some shows. The big show towards the end of his life was called Witnesses Against Our Vanishing, in which the artists did work trying to communicate the need for funding. At the same time, the conservative Senate, led by Senator Jesse Helms from our state and William Dannemeyer in California, were trying to suppress the NEA's funding for arts. And the three people that were the most famous for making what's called obscene art, Wojnarowicz and Andres Serrano, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And I know you guys have all heard of Robert Mapplethorpe. Did, homoerotic photographs. And these senators knew their constituency didn't want us spending money on obscenity. So one of the questions is, where are we with that now? 25 years later, 28, 29 years later. This is around 1990. And this is David's film, Fire in My Belly is the name of the film. I urge you to read this biography of him by Cynthia Carr, which has the history of the East Village in it. And it's a scene from a video that he was making starting in Mexico of a crucifix with roaches crawling over it. In 2010, this was included in a portrait gallery show at the Smithsonian, 18 years after his death, and it was made to be taken down because it was considered sacrilegious and obscene. The Piss Christ, you've probably heard of, is also met with lots of controversy. And that was Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. It was behind glass, once again a crucifix. So these were seen as attacks on Christianity and attacks on morality. James Romberger, who I showed you earlier, and Dave, who were great friends, and his wife is also, Marguerite is a great illustrator. James and David did this book about his life and how hard it was to survive at the end of it. And I'll let you guys take a look at this if you want. And this is a drawing James did. These were all drawings that David asked him to do. And he can no longer really draw and paint anymore by 1991. This didn't get published until 2012. And those guys are friends. I'm in touch with them. They've helped me out a lot with writing my pieces. This is getting to the future now. Where are we going? Those are Kiki Smith's hands. She's 65 and she's in great health, but she's used her hands her whole life over and over again, making things. And I can't show you everything she's done, but let's zip through this. That would be a sculpture of the tongue licking an ear, painted. These are recent, in the 90s and this century. She's concerned with the body as a political subject, which we all have to be these days. Body, the human body, freedom of it or not. And certainly with both the Me Too movement and other things that have been going on, certainly with African Americans getting murdered. We have a lot of subject matter that came out of this period. Artists are focusing on it, and it still continues today. This is one of her drawings. It's pen and ink. She's gotten into this. She and Suko are very much involved in animal rights now and are interested in our relationship with animals on this planet. And that has given them, both of them, kind of subject matter content area to investigate in the last 20 years. This was at the Whitney Biennial in 1990. 91? I might have that date wrong. I went to grad school in the 90s in LA and was watching what happened out of the East Village scene, which, as I said to you, pretty much ended with the Tompkins Square riots. The whole market died. And I was watching what was going on with the artists that still survived while I was in grad school in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles began to have a scene of its own. And there was a show called Helter Skelter that I went to, and it was very much reminiscent of the kind lecture, or presentation, excuse me. This is a Kiki Smith painting using photographs, and it is owned by Wake Forest University. You can see it at Wake Forest now. And this is Walter Robinson. He was in the Cardboard Band. One of the paintings he's doing recently. He's continuing in the pop vein. And I think, oh yeah, and there's Jeffrey Deitch with Kimber Fowler, who I showed you earlier. That's how she dresses up for the voluptuous horror of Karen Black. I'm very happy that we've been able to communicate through the magic of Facebook recently. Jeffrey Deitch has championed the work of that time. So I have some questions for you. If you guys have the energy for a Q&A or have questions for me, and I appreciate you listening to all this stuff. Let's go back to the beginning, and that way we can do whatever we want to do here. If I went too fast, I'm sorry. If I went too slow, I'm also sorry. This is my first time doing this, and I appreciate you guys. I don't know if I can communicate, letting me experiment with you. We've got, I have 3 questions written out now. Oh, so it just dropped. So, and really now I'm going to get unformulated about this. You know, from what you're investigating as students, and you know, art history students particularly, but also studio, if you were doing both, I want you to think about what are the correlations between that time and now, from what you know and what briefly exposed you to. And the one thing that I haven't been pointed out carefully enough is that my qualitative judgments kind of run along the lines of this fulcrum. Certain artists in that period went for mercantilism and fast money. Some artists did both. Some artists remained authentic to their original motivation, to what they were striving to make art. Kiki Smith remained true to her vision and then got rich, but probably because the world caught up with her. She's surviving, she's stayed healthy, and she's continued to work, even though her hands are very sore. So these are the questions I'm wondering if you thought about that, if you noticed that. Fashion and art, art as merchandise, commerce and art. Do they have to be separate? Is an artist's vision polluted by needing to make money? What do you know about the market? What do you know about artists who are out there today? These are things you will be investigating as you go on in art history. As you become more historians or professors, you will be studying this. Where is that business? What is that business? Is it business?
Does an artist not need to make money to continue being an artist?
Heck yeah.
Right? So how do you, I know money seems like the evil thing in this equation, like I'm gonna sort of like a sellout. I guess it doesn't always have to be a sellout, it can be a one-off, and then you feel good that you created something and one person wants it. That gives you enough money back to go on.
Yeah, that's the question I'm asking. Exactly.
And I'm asking you back as an artist.
No.
Not as the, I mean.
Well, you know, it's not a simple answer, but I know the answer is no and yes.
I think that, honestly, sometimes being an artist requires some sort of way to make money before you can actually make an actual living out of art. Like, there's always some sort of period in an artist's life where they have to do something to make money, whether it be like a regular 9-to-5 or a service work job or sex work or whatever they have to do to make ends meet. But like, I feel like that struggle in itself sometimes sends people into
Well, that's true. And I don't want to stop at other questions, but if you investigate whatever of it's in this book, just 7 miles a second. This is about how he made money as a young man on the streets. One of the jobs you mentioned. Kiki Smith was an electrician. She went, worked with an electrician and got a license, I think, as a young lady in the early 80s. Yes, I taught school. I waited tables. We all do. But we're talking about what you do with your art is kind of the question. So
I feel like you might have to define what a creative pollutant even is.
a pollutant is?
Yeah, what a creative pollutant even is. Like if money pollutes the art, well, can't people's opinions also pollute the art? Can't your influences or your struggles pollute the art or any of your thought process, what you learn from your art? Your vision changes all the time. So
Yeah, that's a great point. And the discourse changes too. And that changes in every level, whether it's on the street level, artists talking to each other, or in published critiques. Yeah.
I think it has a lot to do with what you define as success. So success being Kiki Smith, or Cindy Sherman, or someone like that, or is it making an impact in your community and feeling good about that and being productive and showing your work? Because I've known a few artists that have gone to New York and gave back to other communities because they didn't like New York, but they remained fairly productive and they were still collected by the MoMA or something like, some other larger entity like that. But they felt they sold their work in a bookstore more in Detroit as opposed to a downtown gallery in New York, and they liked that better. So it was, to me, as someone who's been a curator and talked to artists too, that I always find the people that, they're not on the fast track, they're not on this gerbil on the wheel, running. And there's lots of gallery dealers that will tell you, I need more of this. Or you bring your work and they're like, I can't sell that. It's all about selling for them, where the artist has a different motivation and you have to find that spot. But if you want to play the game of being in a big gallery, then you need to conform. And if you find a co-op, or a lot of these folks started in smaller co-ops and built their own community, that's a different orientation, I think, than
That's
thinking
what
about
ABC
my only outlet is to try to go big, and that's not a bad thing to aspire to, but there's more than that in the art world.
But that is what ABC No Rio and PS1 and some of those places started out as. And the galleries in East Village that came around at the same time, they felt that they couldn't, I think this dynamic exists in cities now. They couldn't exist in the Soho world. They weren't allowed to be there, they didn't have money to be there. But they also would be restricted by the grants and the fellowships. And so and for a while there, a brief shining moment from like December '82, for about 3 years, those galleries thrived and they were funky and cool and there were things happening that you've never seen before. But then, and this is part of the story that needs to be told, what we call posers and copycats came in. There were people, and if you see the movie Basquiat, there's guys going around trying to make Basquiats on, doorways, and then pull the doorway out and go sell it, that night. And he actually got beat up by some people and said, "Hey, that's mine." That's in the movie anyway. I believe that's a true story. The playground you're talking about, playing field, is constantly in flux. But that's why I think, and you said what constitutes success. This is another reason I'm interested in returning to academia. I was in academia in one form or another for years. Academia is yet one of the refuges now for thinking. And in the 70s, in the art world, it was very stodgy. Conceptualism, minimalism, and abstract expressionism ruled the day. They weren't really even interested in pop artists in most colleges at that time. So, in my experience, that's where the change happened, right as I moved to New York too. Yes, sir.
I just had a thought about, you showed earlier in the show those pieces that sold for $125 million or whatever. Artists didn't get that.
They're dead.
Right. It's and the great financial, amounts for these sales is they're buying. It's almost like a holy relic of history. It's not just they like the lions and stuff. It's a piece of history. It's an original, authentic link back to a very important. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
It's an investment. Yeah, they're pretty. It's a strange kind of money.
These are
It's a
objects.
Basquiat, so it's an investment
Right.
as opposed to.
Anybody.
Exactly. So then you try to play with those buttons. That's kind of neat.
And like one of the great things is like we would be selling like playing cards on the street to people all worth like $15.
Right, yeah.
Now they're like worth
You want some crappy art?
Yeah.
So you've seen that film. That's a great film. I taught at Blue Ridge Community College. Boy, that was a fish out of water, but I taught that every class at some point during the semester. Kids would get up and leave. That was okay. I didn't show the whole movie. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned AIDS, and with whether it was heroin or sex, so many people were dying. I mean, tens of thousands of people, and particularly in New York City, were going down. And the wider culture basically didn't notice it. I'm curious how you think that influenced the nature of the art, which has such a dark cast to it. You allude to this, but also the people, so many of these artists died, and how did that affect the value and how we perceive their art?
And I wish I spelled that out. Kiki Smith's sister, who was one of the Cardboard Band members, died in '86 of AIDS. So she was involved in that show. There were witnesses to our witnesses show, witnesses against our vanishing. Remember that. With David, there's a. I don't want to digress, but there's a section in that biography where Peter Hujar, who had been David's lover and a friend, passed away, and a week later another friend of theirs died, and he had already found out he was HIV positive, and it's the story of Kiki and him dancing together in the apartment, and this kind of ghost dance. I think we had to go through that period of activism beyond art. Art wasn't good enough for what needed to happen at the time. And that's delineated pretty well in that biography at the end. And that's why David, also he was getting sick, but he did a lot of work, maybe not painting, but a lot of graphic work and certainly poetic work about that subject. And to answer your question, I think Kiki Smith, that's a specter that's with her in everything she does, particularly this obsession with the body. And in later work, the imagination. I don't know if we have that kind of intensity of awareness. We're certainly not in any kind of focus anymore. How can you with the internet? I think that's a good point, and I'll remember that with future presentations to point that out.
How do you feel about the current creative climate? Since I haven't had the great area.
That's the last question. Who are the young artists that I should care about or know about? I can tell you that I'm kind of flummoxed. There's so much going on. It's all varied. I don't really know what's the scene, if there is a scene.
It doesn't feel like there's a definitive voice yet, and also there's that disconnect with it seems like my painting teacher told me is you don't send in art, you don't walk into galleries, they don't find you through any means outside the internet, which is really impersonal.
It's true.
So I feel
Even in New York, all the galleries, except for the Uptown galleries, which have always been in 57th Street, where the money is, are all on 21st Street. All 22nd Street. And PPOW is there. And you can see all the art that's kind of edgy. There's a couple places in East Village. One of them's called Howl, named after Ginsberg, and somewhat devoted to. See, Ginsberg lived in East Village in the 50s and 60s, and stayed there actually his whole life. So this is another presentation, but the beatnik scene happened there then and in San Francisco. and it was kind of rejuvenated during the 80s. I feel like that kind of focus could happen again. It's certainly happened in some, movements like, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement. Those aren't specifically art movements, though film, movies that have come out certainly reflect what's going on. I think you're right to say that we don't really have the same culture. It's completely different. Those of you who've grown up with devices are wired differently. Sydney and I have discussed this before. We're working on an animated film, which has taken a back seat to other things, but I can't think like my son does or you guys do. We need to find ways to connect.
It's almost like in the search for finding ways to connect, you lose the genuine connection. It's almost like in finding ways to connect, you like lose the ability to truly connect with people. Instead of trying to connect with so many people, you don't get the genuine.
Right, it's not real. It's distancing. I'm sure there's a lot being written in the cultural world about that, psychology of that, the psychology of distancing. To me, the awareness of it began in the discourse with the Frankfurt School, if y'all have studied that at all. German Marxists that fled Hitler, all but one of them, Walter Benjamin, didn't get out. Well, he thought he was getting ready to get caught and committed suicide. But anyway, those guys brought what we consider Marxist theory to the university's cultural theory. It's not advocating one social system or another, or governmental system. It was just a way of deconstructing culture, which has turned into Marxist feminist over the years, for 20 or 30 years now. And that's actually kind of an old philosophy now. We need to, there's the fascination with the other part of deconstruction, I won't say politics, but writing. And as you go further into critical theory, a lot of hairs are split, but they might be hairs that need to be split. I'm asking now, what do y'all think about this? The discourse is going on now in the world. Is it distancing in the campuses or in colleges? Connecting, or is it distancing? And both? What are we doing? I'm wondering. That's why I'm doing this. Trying to find out. I want to go all around the country doing this. Y'all have helped me out just now with these questions. I'd love more questions if you have any thoughts, ideas, certainly critiques is fine, I don't care.
I mean, when it comes to digital, I feel like it creates a second self, like another.
I can't hear you.
I feel like digital creates like a second self, like an alternate one, like really like the you that you perceive, and then there's like the you present on the internet.
But doesn't all art?
Hmm?
The argument can be made that all art is doing that too.
I have to say, I'm really interested in like photography as the medium, and like for me, having like a digital outlet, like my Instagram is like just my art that I post, and I'm easily connected with other artists like around the world who like YouTube is a thing, like vloggers and all that stuff. Like they're able to show how they like make their work while also having like a platform,
right?
Like Instagram or like a social media outlets like post their work without just having it in like a gallery in one location in the world, which is also like really interesting. And it's interesting to see like different trends throughout like where people are living,
Instagram.
Yeah, it's like a big. I think the medium of photography is very digital in itself, so that is like flourishing. When like I don't know about like painting, I think that would be like less of a.
That's a serious argument about art making.
I was gonna say, like, kind of to your first question, relating to kind of like when you're a sellout, those people that are, I feel like those people that are on the internet like trying to spread their message through the internet, sometimes it's more about staying relevant. So if you're not posting, if you're not doing something, if you're not creating something, then you lose relevancy. So to keep up, people just create this safe community, put something out there, regardless if they're proud of it or not.
Or if it's inspired at all.
Yeah.
That happens in the music world a lot. You have to. You pay someone to go text your fans and pretend you're you.
Yeah, I wonder, to me, a lot of that seems to relate to Warhol as a precursor of fashioning of yourself as your art form. And looking at, this one here, and the idea of the performative aspect of that, and how you perform your gender, how you perform your persona, and all, people craft that. And that to me seems to be kind of the driving force of, even if someone doesn't realize it, they are crafting their persona, and how they look, and how their mannerisms, and what they study, and how they study other people. And Warhol was kind of the beginning, in many ways, of that.
Branding. Yeah, it's a really multi-layered subject. As we are investigating here, I just recently watched a Warhol video that was probably made, 90 something. And, he really was subversive for his time. He was not trying, he was trying to be exactly where the minimalists and conceptualists and the Abex people and even Rauschenberg and Johns were by being antithetical. But he was coming, he knew he wasn't coming out of nowhere, So he, as a fashion illustrator, a man who drew shoes for a living and decorated Bloomingdale's and stuff, it was very similar to what Rauschenberg and Johns had done 20 years earlier, or 15, really, 7 or 8 years earlier. But he saw what he had in the mid-60s, and it changed in the rock and roll scene and the whole youth culture. And I would pretty much submit that that's when a general awareness of what we now call culture wars existed. It became cool to be subversive for the first time. So, now we have many different camps. You dress like you were a camp that you're in. But because of the diffuse nature of how information is gathered, how much inspiration is behind any of these posts? Or who's got time to care? And that's kind of the downside of what Warhol was pointing out.
It's superficial.
It's
that he cultivated too.
Yeah. He believed in it. He didn't believe in anything too deep. At least not as an artist. But I didn't know him personally. I shook his hand though. The show that Warhol and Basquiat had together, I went to. And part of the story is that after that, they didn't see each other at all hardly, because the papers, the critics lambasted that show and said that Basquiat was Warhol's mascot, and he was just making hay out of Basquiat's fame, and it broke both of them's heart, and they resented each other. I can tell you this much: at that show, it was at Tony Shafrazi Gallery, which is the gallery that Keith Haring got famous for, sold a lot. By the time I got there, I had to work that day. I got there late, it was a Friday. Everybody was out on the street with Basquiat and his crew, and it was Warhol, Shafrazi, and Bruno. And I went and shook his hand and said, "This is great, I love it." There was nobody else there. I could have been Valerie Solanas with a gun. You guys know about her? Warhol was shot in 66, 68, maybe 70, at the factory, at his factory. Anyway, that's another presentation that has some connection to. There were some people from Chapel Hill that had worked for him. So anyway, guys, I would love to take some more questions. I think if y'all want to, we can hang out in the studio, and I really appreciate you coming and joining me. It's been a lot to me. It'll help me refine this, and like I said, I'd love to share what I actually finished writing for publication for you to have to look at, and this is going to go on and on for a while. There's a lot to investigate, so, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Having folks come right here in the middle of the end of the semester. Good luck with your projects and refine them. Don't freak out, you'll be fine. Appreciate it.
Thank you, George.
Feel free to contact me if you'd like to. Lisa's got my contact info, and I'll be glad to share. Thanks, guys. Hey, thank you for coming. You asked the greatest question. I need to put that through. Hey, I'm Morgan. Morgan, pleased to meet you, Morgan.
Soft speaker.
Are you studio?
Yeah, I'm music major.
Are you guys
yeah, we're in the
Hey, you go, Lee! Go!
Yeah. So you go over there in the building.
See that sitting there going?
Yeah, we have a class. Yeah, like my most interested subject. I'm not this time period and black anthropology. It's
yeah, I mean that's another. There's an extra stack. I think there's an extra right.
It's just there are so many that they created out that you really see
People say that if you shut down by the world,
yeah, they made it
they didn't agree with each other.